Thank you very much. I'm always glad when Harley invites me to come here and speak because it moves to the top of my agenda issues and thoughts that I should spend more time thinking about, but that in the great trans-North Atlantic scrum tend to be lost. Let me start by saying that I started out by thinking I would just talk about 1850 to 1950 on the grounds that that was enough, but I found I could not. I found I had to go way back before 1850 and after 1950 to try to make sense of what I was thinking. And let me also say that I'm not sure of what I am thinking. That is, usually I have opinions on an issue that I hold very strongly. They may be wrong, they sometimes are. They may change, they often do. But one of the things I'm very good at is convincing myself that what I think of at the moment is the most clear, transparent, and irrefutable doctrine in existence. That's not true today. And so today I don't have many answers, but I do have a lot of questions that I've been thinking and reading and trying to write a lot about the Latin American economic experience over the past 12 millennia, and finding first that I have to situate it in its context. That is, overwhelmingly, the Latin American economy is seen in the context of the enormous Anglo-American economy to its north, and viewed by that yardstick as a significant failure of potential. And that certainly is a valid perspective. But the reasons traditionally advanced in the history profession in Anglo-America about why this is so, that seems to derive in most part from the black legend of the Spanish Empire, created in England in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries as a means of national mobilization against Spain and for the protection of the Tudor and then the Stuart dynasties, and carried over here, and it doesn't really apply. So I'm going to try to situate Latin American economy in its full context, which is not just relative to the Anglo-American economies, but also relative to the Iberian economies, the mother country economies, to the pre-conquest era, and most recently relative to the Pacific Rim. The Pacific Rim, starting in 1950, has served as the most recent example of an economy that works well, and compared to which the economies of Latin America can be held up as failing in relative terms, relative to that yardstick. And as I said or hinted in my subtitle, before 1850, it was Latin America that was the prize for New World settlement. Mexico and Peru, right? The unbelievable wealth, as Europe saw it, of Mexico and Peru. Never mind that most of it was simply a highly concentrated set of precious metal artifacts. And that although populations were dense, thanks to the early and successful domestication of corn, right, the absence of ironworking, the absence of metallurgy, meant that living standards were relatively low. But still, after the Spanish and Portuguese conquest, it was Latin America that was the prize. Mexico and Peru offered large estates and broad numbers of people to work for you if you managed to get in at the top of the social fabric. There was the Silver Mountain of Potosi, there were the Sugar Islands, there were all the incredibly valuable biologicals of the New World, of which probably the most valuable in world historical perspective has been none other but the potato. But a whole continent full of interesting and useful crops that fueled population explosions not just in Europe but throughout Asia via the Columbian Exchange in the centuries after the conquest. And it really was Europe's most prosperous, civilized, and technologically progressive peoples that grasped the opportunity opened up by the accidental discovery of the Portuguese, who caught by the wind as they sailed a little too far to the west and trying to get around Africa, and of Christopher Columbus's incredible failure to actually find Japan or China or any place where he could actually find the cinnamon that he was so anxious to get and bring back. It's conventional in North America, in Anglo-America, to think of Castilian conquistadores followed by the priests and the inquisitors of the Inquisition as the people who made the Spanish and Portuguese, to a lesser extent, Portuguese conquests of the New World. And yes, there are conquistadores. Yes, none of us would like to be in a bar with a drunk Pizarro or Cortez under any circumstances. But there was an awful lot more. Right? It was Portuguese mariners. Right? It was Portuguese mariners who were able to go places where no one else in the world was able to go in the 15th century with better and more durable ships and better and more durable means of navigation and records than anyone else, who started the great Atlantic adventure of Iberia in the 15th century. It was Aragonese merchants. Right, it was Aragonese merchants who moved from the Mediterranean to Seville and then off to the New World, looking for things to trade, looking for ways to substitute for and disintermediate the Middle Eastern bloc trade to other parts of the world that they had grown up with. And they did indeed come from the most advanced and civilized and progressive and rich part of the European world then. Remember that Ferdinand of Trastamara is not just king of Aragon and count of Barcelona, but he is part of a dynasty that had various times ruled Provence, Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, a whole bunch of others, the Balearic Islands, that the only thing keeping the Aragonese crown from becoming monarchs not just of Spain, of Italy, was their king's occasional desire to give some province away to a younger son or other. When you think of who comes to the New World, you should think not of a bunch of Don Quixotes who happen to be younger and have sharp swords, not of a bunch of people from Castile who have lost their social role with the successful eviction of the Caliphate from Cordova. But you should also think of the Portuguese mariners and the Aragonese merchants, even though they were, in the end, backed up by Castilian crusader steel, to the Incas and to the war chief of the Mexicas' great discomfort. Moving back a little bit from entrepreneurship and enterprise, we can move back to technology. And think that the arsenal of Barcelona was even larger than the arsenal of Venice with respect to its ability to build and launch ships in the very early form of mass production in the 14th and 15th centuries. And if we look back at political history, when we think of parliamentary liberties and freedom of speech, of the ability of nobles to stand up in the Cortes of Castile and tell Carlos I exactly what they think of this guy whose native tongue is Dutch, his ideas of who should be his viceroys in Spain, or the repeated declarations of the assemblies of Barcelona, that they will be loyal to their count as long as their count provides them with good lordship, and if not, not. If you compare the amount of give and take and political respect for the rights of the subject in the Aragon and Catalonia of Ferdinand Trastamara, and even in the Castile of Isabella Trastamara, the Trastamaras being an unusually prolific dynasty, ruling several countries at the same time, even before they married. Compare that to the England of Henry Tudor, where you were an extremely rare chancellor if you managed to survive the reign. And I think the only one who, well, no, his last chancellors did indeed outlive him, but before then, basically your only chance was to die before you got, of natural causes, before you got chopped. that few people would have said in the reign of the Plantagenets or the Tudors, that the future of representative institutions, rule of law, respect for the rights and property of the subject, that those had their home in England rather than in the Aragon of Ferdinand, or even in Castile, which had a very sophisticated way of dealing with, say, its principal biotechnological asset, the unmatched merino sheep, which was what made Castile in the first half of the second millennium an extremely valuable place in spite of very little rain. Very little rain, but a very good piece of biotechnology for transforming what rain there was and grass into high-quality wool. And this lasted. Indeed, the empire of liberty worldwide had a much better advocate in Simon Bolivar than in George Washington and his successors. Bolivar, after all, freed not just his own slaves, but all the slaves of Venezuela at the same time. George Washington freed his slaves, but only after his death. Thomas Jefferson freed some of his slaves, if they were his direct biological descendants. James Madison and James Monroe, they did not free their slaves. John Adams and John Quincy Adams are the first of the two, or the only two of the first 6 American presidents to have no slaves. And the latter, in fact, fought all his life for the petitions of slaves to be heard in American Congress. But John Quincy Adams lost to Andrew Jackson, who spent his life trying to buy more slaves. Martin Van Buren had only one slave, Tom, but when Tom ran away, Van Buren then sold him to the slave catcher for $50. William Henry Harrison, he tried to turn Indiana into slave territory while he was governor. John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor. Not until we get to the incredibly well-known and respected Millard Fillmore do we get another American president even as close to free soil as the Adamses were. And even Millard Fillmore, his view was, quote, "God knows that I detest slavery, but it is an existing evil for which we are not responsible. And we must give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution, till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world." A paragraph that reads to us as one of immense irony, but not so far, not to them. Moving back from individual politicians' attachment to liberty to the stability of the political system, well, look at US politics in the first 20 years after the Constitutional Convention. Washington thought his own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, was on the point of betraying the interests of the United States to those of France, on the grounds that the triumph of the French Republic's ideas in Europe was much more important than whether the United States, small colonial thing, remained democratic or not. France, after all, had 30 million people. The United States had 4. That he was Secretary of the United States, State for the United States. And Jefferson was certain that John Adams was plotting to restore the British monarchy. And John Adams would have plotted to restore the British monarchy had he become convinced that the alternative was the coming to power of some American Robespierre, who he feared Jefferson or his successor might become. And Alexander Hamilton is off there in the wings raising a standing army for some purpose that's unclear, but that made Jefferson and Madison fear he was on the point of becoming a military dictator. And Hamilton is then shot dead by Jefferson's running mate and vice president, Aaron Burr, whom Jefferson then tried for treason 2 years later. And Burr was not convicted of treason solely because the Chief Justice, John Marshall, himself a friend of Adams and Hamilton, thought that if he set Burr free, Burr yet might cause Jefferson yet more trouble. Compare that history to any history of political chaos and Machiavellian manipulation in any Latin American country you choose. Maybe Paraguay is worse, but it's close. It's close. Thus, we have this puzzle. Living standards, natural resources, population densities, rates of demographic expansion give Latin America an edge over Anglo-America through the first quarter of the 19th century at least, and the appeals to the deep roots, whether they're political appeals to the Empire of Liberty and to its long establishment since Magna Carta, a document that was signed by King John but then promptly disavowed by him, and it only became of doubtful legal relevance later. Or even the love of our friends down at Stanford, of Weingaston North, for the British common law tradition and for the coming of the rule of law with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. If you actually go back and look through the history of the growth and development of representative institutions, yes, you can see the threads, but you can see equally large or larger threads present in throughout Iberia, at least up through the suppression of the revolt of the Catalans at the end of the 30 Years' War. So, Latin America and Anglo-America in the first quarter of the 19th century, you know, about the same in living standards, not quite the same in natural resources, surely far from the same in terms of accessible geography. Right? That the Missouri, Mississippi, Ohio river system coupled with the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes give an enormous edge in water transportation and thus in potential economic development to Anglo-America, because the great rivers of South America, they don't run any place where you can do lots of wheat-based temperate farming incredibly well. That just doesn't work in the upper Amazon. It doesn't especially work well in the foothills of the Andes, even so. There's a potential geographic edge, but that's about it. And then you have the coming of the steam engine, and then a generation later, the coming of the telegraph. And those ought to have brought the world together in terms of ironing out economic divergences. That when you can move goods and ideas very cheaply and quickly throughout the world, we expect to have a world that becomes more equal, not a world that becomes less equal. Indeed, if you go back to the, say, 1848, and if you ask John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx what they agree about, well, one of the few things they agree about is that the whole world is going to industrialize. The whole world is going to become capitalist as soon as bourgeois institutions and the rule of law can spread through it. And that what's now going on in Britain and France that they saw is going to be going on in the entire world by the end of the 19th century. And technology, the technologies of the Industrial Revolution. Right, the first generation of industrial technologies circa 1780, it is true that they work only in Britain. That you need a place with uniquely high real wages because it has managed to concentrate all of the profits of global transoceanic trade into one small island by virtue of having the most competent navy, coupled with a uniquely low price of coal at the factory gate by virtue of being a country without mountains that's lucky enough to have had a lot of ferns dying there 400 million years ago. But by 1850, steam engines, spinning jennies, power looms, and railroads, they're potentially profitable everywhere. Yet the story of economic development is one of a steadily widening gap between Anglo-America and Latin America starting toward the second quarter of the 19th century. You know, the southern cone aside, the differences grow decade by decade up until 1918. And then starting in 1918 or so, in terms of relative economic development, the southern cone, you know, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, fall off the wagon as well, and start going massively backward in terms of relative economic growth, all up except Venezuela, which up until 1950 is greatly buoyed by oil. But think of it, Buenos Aires is 11th in the world in telephones per capita come 1913. You know, you want to look at a technologically progressive city in 1913. Buenos Aires isn't San Francisco, but you know, it is easily Philadelphia compared to the world. And the fact that Argentina's economy has done so badly relatively since does mean that BA now is a uniquely well-preserved example of a beautiful Belle Epoque place to visit, and I recommend you do so. But that wasn't so good for the people of Argentina. So come 1950 or so, you find a 4 or 5 to 1 differential in terms of living standards and productivity levels between Anglo-America and Latin America, you know, except for Venezuela. A gap that then neither closes nor widens in relative terms between 1950 and today. And you may say this is no worse than the rest of the ex-North Atlantic world performed between 1850 and 1950, between 1850 and today. But all of the cultural and resource and reasons usually adduced for why it is especially difficult to bring the technologies of the Industrial Revolution and the institutes of governance needed to create a successful capitalist economy to Africa or to India or to China or to Indonesia, those don't apply, right, to Latin America, unless you want to draw an enormous line at the Pyrenees and say that whatever is below the Pyrenees is not part of Western Europe. And that certainly would have been an enormous surprise, right, to anyone back at the time. Theories of economic relative retardation and growth. Inevitably, they fall, as my old teacher David Landis said, into 2 broad categories. The first is the rich are rich and the poor are poor because the rich are so good and the poor are so bad. The second is the rich are rich and the poor are poor because the rich are so bad and the poor are so good. And no matter how you try to write about this, eventually you find yourself falling into one of those 2 camps, as you're either impressed by resilience or impressed by entrepreneurial energy or horrified by exploitation or simply puzzled by failures to grasp opportunities that are clearly there. And that, I think, doesn't tend to lead to good history, that what you have is always a bunch of people about like people everywhere trying to do their best, subject to their own innate original sinfulness and also original charity, trying to do their best in the particular historical environments in which they find themselves. And if we try to erase, you know, the moral judgments that either conquest or suffering are by nature good, we do find ourselves with 3 broad theories of why it is that, you know, Latin American economy finds itself come 1950 and come today with what is a much larger gulf relative to Anglo-America than it really should have, given historical roots and legacy, and given the extraordinary ease in this age of the internet and containerization of moving not just goods, but people and technologies and ideas to practically anywhere across the globe. And the first is that international trade and the international economy are in general going to be engines of extraction theories. That the world market dangles gaudy prizes in front of you, but it's a confidence game, right? And you make investments in, say, Brazilian rubber, thinking, hey, we're the home of rubber. This is a uniquely valuable commodity in a world that is going to be running on internal combustion engines, that it wants to go places where railroads haven't been laid. And then you find out not just that there are clever German organic chemists who are figuring out how to make the stuff in Hamburg, where the rubber plant does not grow at all, but also that the British have conquered Malaysia. And the first thing they did when they conquered Malaysia was build a fort. The second thing they did was establish a botanical garden. And then they discovered that the rubber plant grows incredibly well in Malaysia, because all of its pests and parasites are 10,000 miles away. And so the Opera House at Manaus falls into disuse because there's no longer enough surplus from the Brazilian rubber tapping industry to pay to bring Sarah Bernhardt and Enrico Caruso over to perform. On the other hand, there are the poor Ethiopians, where you can't grow rubber, but which is the original home of the coffee plant. And if there were any justice, Ethiopia and Yemen ought to be the caffeine-growing OPECs of the 21st century, but they're not. Because the coffee plant grows very well in Brazil as well, and all of its pests and parasites are 10,000 miles away in Africa, on the Horn of Africa. So comparative advantage traps, debt traps, vulnerability to cyclical fluctuations traps, escape from the trap via neo-mercantilist protection of one form or another, inward focus on resource accumulation, and import substitution industrialization. But all those increase the stakes at play in domestic politics. And there's the tremendous danger of trying to turn the global economy into your servant rather than your master through clever technocratic policies of one sort or another, because it requires that you actually be governed by technocrats, which requires that your ruling class be far-sighted, which is never a good thing to acquire. And these are the theories of Raul Prebisch. This is the Fernando Enrique Cardozo, at least the early Fernando Enrique Cardozo. This is Emanuel Wallerstein. And it's definitely one view. Then there are the unorthodox Marxist class structure of Fetter on development theories. Latifundia and neo-feudalism as key blockages to successful economic development. People find ways to sit at pressure points where value is created and use their family position, their rights to ownership of particular forms of property, their political influence to extort extremely high taxes. And not just rural neo-feudalism, right? Think of the heyday of the PRI in Mexico as a new class, a bureaucratic variant of robber baronage and clientage, focused on extracting rents for political power brokers and their clients from the most productive pressure points of the economy. Natural resources, high productivity export manufacturing, tourism where you could successfully unionize. And this is the theory of Hernando de Soto and his other path. These are the many, many papers written by my freshman roommate Andre Schleifer and his various co-authors on legal origins. How having a legal system that's flexible in the beginning to allow for a government to do more eventually winds up so that it takes 180 days and 43 bribes to start a taxi in Bogota. And Ashimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson's comparative origins. But what makes these people unorthodox Marxists is that Karl Marx believed in progress. Karl Marx believed that in the end, Hegel's world spirit would show itself in reality. Karl Marx believed that what was going on in the economic would eventually have its day. And so a bourgeois revolution would be inevitable. Right? The superstructure could not indefinitely contain the pressures being generated by the economic changes of the base, any more that as you piled more and more coal underneath the boiler with flaws in it and closed off all the steam exits, that the boiler could remain intact. In the end, Marx thought all of the feudal and neo-feudal and aristocratic and caste and market-based and estate-based blockages to market capitalism, and thus prosperity, would be steamed away, right, by the white heat of modern technology. The phrase translated, "all that is solid melts into air," in English really does not do the German of the Communist Manifesto justice. It's an allusion to a technologically deterministic wave that can't be resisted forever, right? And this gave Marx a great deal of hope that he was on the side of history. Right, his intellectual successors, at least those evolving in the kind of legal origins, comparative origins schools, are much less kind of hopeful. And then, of course, there's the one unfortunate accident after another theories. That the long 19th century required either fluency in English or an exceptionally favorable geographic environment, which the Southern Cone did have, in order to successfully adapt and adopt the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, simply because the machines were not yet that good, and you needed to have a base society which was a very comfortable place for lots of engineers, many of them trained in Scotland, to work simply to keep anything running. And then come the 20th century, well, unless you're the United States and have a head start, you already have a well-populated, rich, continent-sized market in order to provide for high value-added, high mass productivity industries. That anywhere else, if you want to use the most modern mass production technologies, you need to take advantage of the world market of globalization. And your bets on globalization crap out with the coming of the Great Depression. And when, say, my grandfather's counterparties in Argentina find that my grandfather at his tannery in Brockton will in fact not allow them to renegotiate the price that he and they have settled on for hides now that the British government has devalued the pound. That he says a contract is a contract and we're close to going bankrupt up here in Brockton. You promise to accept pounds, and that the pound is now worth a third less in terms of dollars. That's not my lookout, you owe delivery. He did in the end get delivery with a suspicious amount of rocks among the hides to make up the weight. And in fact, 2 years later had to close down and move to Maine from Brockton, Massachusetts in search of a cheaper labor force. But bets on globalization crap out with the coming of the Great Depression, imperial preference, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Bets on import substitution, as people painfully learned the Great Depression, then crap out again, as they miss the biggest expansion of world trade ever in the 30 glorious years. The then switch to neoliberal policies get squashed by the oil shocks, the coming of monetarism with interest rates in non-dollar currencies that go above 20% per year, and more recently the rise of China. That if you had thought you were going to follow the example of previous successful industrializers by starting with very relatively low value, low cost, mass-produced goods and going up the value chain, well, guess again. There are 1.2 million Chinese who want to do that too. Plus, there's collateral damage from the Cold War, right? That the Cold War in Asia gave Japan and the rest of the Pacific Rim preferential access to Anglo-America's markets because it was very important to demonstrate that that part of Asia on this side of the bamboo curtain was a prosperous, growing society as opposed to the other side, which was not. The Cold War in Europe was fought on terrain where the property right that had bet on Nazism and fascism had to keep its head down for at least a generation. Now 2 generations. Hopefully we'll make it 3. We'll see. But the Cold War in Latin America had neither of those advantages, and the collateral damage was significant. But do we really have to choose? Right? That, after all, the defects of trying to work in an unstable, globalized world market when you lack a sufficiently large domestic market to realize economies of scale, those defects can be evaded via clever technocrats pursuing state-led development. But in Lance Pritchett's words, there's absolutely nothing worse than state-led development policies pursued by an anti-developmental state. You know, the anti-developmental state that trapped much of Latin America was indeed the product of unfortunate early wealth concentration and frontier absence, coupled with a grave suspicion of what would happen if the lower classes ever managed to read Rousseau and Locke, let alone Marx. But perhaps it could have been surmounted, except for the unfortunate accidents which did predate the Cold War. That, after all, it was FDR who said that while Somoza may be an SOB, he is our SOB. And unfortunate accidents would not have had as nearly as large deleterious effects had the global economy been more genuinely open and stable and predictable, and less likely to run into episodes in which the North Atlantic that you're relying on as your importer of last resort decides that it doesn't like the game and it's going to cash in its chips, close up, and go home. And from this perspective, Latin American relative retardation, even in the Southern Cone from 1850 to 1950, looks overdetermined. That it would have pretty much had to have been a miracle had it not taken place. Things had to go very right in the extended North Atlantic. And they did in many ways, with the exception of 50 million dead in World War II and 12 million dead in World War I. So right is not the right word, but at least economic development was there. And in the end, literacy, life expectancy, prosperity, vastly better than in 1825, and vastly better than Africa, than South Asia, than non-coastal East Asia, although that perhaps only for the moment. We do not really know what is going to happen when the, say, we still call it communism with Chinese characteristics, when what may still be called coastal communism with Chinese characteristics tries to extend its tentacles inland, where there still are 800 million subsistence peasants in China, let alone in South Asia. And right now, better than in Muscovy and its dependencies. Right? Relative retardation is relative to the North Atlantic plus the Asian Pacific Rim only. Now, nobody intelligent, I think, would say they know what the relative weight is to be assigned to these different overdetermining factors in all of these beautiful theories. Only a very strong desire to obtain tenure, and the necessity to do so by publishing articles that definitively establish or refute particular narrow theses could induce anyone sane to even try to claim that they can unweave the loom of history and figure out exactly what effects Turner had most. But looking forward, the more interesting question is, there are these manifold burdens of the past. We have lots of explanations. Do the burdens of the past still lie heavy on the future? The chance of making the global economy your servant rather than your master, of copying the North Atlantic and actually benefiting from, rather than finding your economy shocked and destroyed in various ways by global economic shifts. Well, here the news is bad, because over the past 2 decades, neither the North Atlantic nor the Pacific Rim have been able to master the global economy. Instead, episodes of policy disorder and macroeconomic stress that those of us who focused on the North Atlantic used to see as confined to Latin America are now global. Right? As Paul Krugman says, that there is nothing better for him than to have been a student of Rudi Dornbusch in order to understand the political economy of the European monetary system. Class structure of Federon development. As income inequality in the United States surpasses levels ever seen in Brazil, and as rent-seeking in everything from Berkeley NIMBYism to the ability of a very narrow fossil fuel complex interest group in the United States to block urgent action on global warming, to the ability of the princes of Wall Street to continue to extract their fortunes, in spite of having caused systemic risk on a truly massive scale. It seems not that Latin America has the promise of attaining the kind of institutional successes seen in the post-World War II North Atlantic. It seems more rather that the post-World War II the 21st century North Atlantic appear to be figuring out new and creative ways to copy institutional failure. You know, could we pray for good luck? As I say, it's hard to see what else we can do. You know, I recommend a big procession this December on the day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, asking her to help us. That after all, God knows the North Atlantic has not been immune to history, as World Wars I and II and the Great Depression will teach you. But at least it was a history of grasping technological possibilities in some ways too well, with the advent of mechanized warfare and nuclear weapons and so forth, but at least the possibilities were grasped and the problems were due to reactions to them. But now it looks like it's more likely that the burdens of the past in Latin America will continue, and that North American history will become more like what Latin American history has been as that becomes the new normal. And let me stop there. Questions? Yes?
What do you think that is the importance of lack of economic integration in Latin America for the development? As an example, Chile has more trade with USA than China than Argentina.
Yes. Well, there's the Andes in the way, which does make it difficult, right? You know, that even in the age of railroads, you'd expect it to be much easier to move things by water, these durable things by water, right, than by land. You know, and Cape Horn is nasty even for container ships. So I'm certainly Chile should be taking advantage of adverse seasonality to send every agricultural crop it grows and more up to Long Beach during the Northern Hemisphere winter. Right, that is a uniquely good economic opportunity open to it, and the fact that it doesn't sell, grapes or even much wine to Argentina is not a terribly bad thing. And as the experience of Europe teaches us, we have to be very careful when we go for close international economic integration to be sure that that integration is proper for those countries. That is, you want to think of what would have happened to Mexico in 1994 and 1945 if the usurper Carlos Salinas de Gortari had not merely pegged the peso to the dollar, but had actually joined the dollar in some kind of North American currency union. And you look at Greece and you look at Spain now and you double that in terms of the economic distress that would have been generated in Mexico as a result, with accompanying political distress as well. Because in Europe, at least, free movement of people came before. Right? The Schengen Accords came before the kind of economic integration. So there's at least a migration safety valve. And while there is a migration safety valve from Mexico to the United States, we do not want to put too much additional pressure on that, given the current state of American politics. As anyone who watches TV during American Election Day tomorrow can regularly learn. Yes?
Could you talk a little about Brazil's relationship with Africa as possibly an exit strategy for this?
Oh. I mean, the problem always is that Africa is a healthy population, but is still in many ways such a small economy, right? That it's very hard to see, an African middle class as a large source of demand for the products of an economy as large as that of Brazil today. And similarly, hard to see what Brazil would actually need from Africa that it could not get about as cheaply from elsewhere. That the idea that countries that are similarly vulnerable to world economic shocks ought to be able to find a way to avoid or a way to integrate among themselves in such a way that they don't wind up somehow giving most of the surplus to the Sharpies in the North Atlantic who know how the system works. But these days, the Sharpies in the North Atlantic don't appear to know how the system works terribly well. And the shocks will still be there and will still be large. And so the strategy is still dangerous. Yeah, Harley?
What about China, specifically in terms of Latin America? The huge demand for raw materials in China slows the preparations.
Yes. Well, until the engine of demand in the North Atlantic gets running again, and until the North Atlantic once again becomes the world's importer of last resort, if you want to sell more, you have to sell it to China, right? And so a strong export-oriented growth strategy is really a bet that China will successfully manage its next generation or two of economic growth without running into any of the horrible things that could happen. Political, economic, geographic, environmental, those of us who were brought up on, the kind of nice belief that successful economic and political development went hand in hand, and that increases in the franchise and in democracy were essential to a rapidly growing and industrializing economy, and where you didn't have not just increasing democracy, but democracy increasing fast enough, things went terribly wrong. That those of us brought up on the Barrington Moore's social origins of dictatorship and democracy line of thinking, which most people my age and older were, tend to look at China and see it, as if an elephant were there flying around with a very small number of wings, that something should have small wingspan, something should have happened by now. That either economic development should have provoked more governmental accountability, or the lack of governmental accountability should have induced some kind of economic crisis. And I say this view is shared not just by elderly academics, middle-aged and elderly academics in the United States. It is also shared by the princes and the princelings of the Chinese Communist Party. That is, China's enormous export surpluses over the past 15 years have been building up wealth outside of China one way or another. And even though the government of the People's Republic of China at the moment still holds title to a great deal of that wealth, I can't help but be convinced that there are processes and contingency plans in motion, so that if anything horrible did happen to the current party's power in China, a lot of princes would show up in New York with valid title to a bunch of treasury bonds held at the Federal Reserve that had been in the hands of the People's Bank of China until the previous Thursday. That it's an interesting time. Yes?
Speaking of Chinese investment in Latin America, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the construction of, or the incoming construction of the Interoceanic Canal through Nicaragua.
Well, it will be a very bad thing for Panama, right? Unless they can successfully strike, in basically Panama's canals earnings are going to have at best, right? And that's if they manage to successfully cartelize and successfully share what's coming in. Whether it will produce a lot of additional trade and benefits for the rest of Latin America seems to me unclear, right? That is, Latin America's economy still, with the exception of Chile, it still overwhelmingly faces the Atlantic, right? And the principal use of the Panama Canal is as ways for the United States' east and west coast to communicate with each other more cheaply than by sending railroad car or containers on railroad flatbed cars through Chicago and the Chicago and Kansas City bottlenecks. And also alternative shipping routes from Europe to East Asia, then going around the Cape of Good Hope. So it will be a wonderful thing for Nicaragua. Not so good a thing for Panama, but I think is unlikely to have first-order effects elsewhere. Yes?
To whatever extent you find the Piketty and science analyses useful or illuminating for Europe and North America, what light do you think, if any, it sheds on inequality in Latin America's economic development and currency?
Someone should find out. Right? There are several open dissertations right now on replicating Piketty's wealth studies for Latin America. And one view is that, with the absence of the extraordinary rise of progressive taxes needed to fight Europe's wars, and then diverted to fund the social insurance state, plus the absence of both the Nazi Wehrmacht and then the United States Army Air Force, kind of to successfully blow up whatever capital you have. So much so that the late Rudy Dornbusch again used to speak of after World War II, of going with his father back to where his father's printing press had been and digging out the big, huge presses from the rubble and trying to get them to work again, and slaughtering pigs and then curing the bacon so they could actually have something to trade to the workers who had survived, so they could actually start printing up leaflets for the American occupational authorities and get the engine of enterprise going again. Latin America avoids that. And so it stays in what Piketty describes as the Belle Epoque equilibrium, in which the rent-seeking, incredibly rich ruling class continues to be a ruling class and manages to fend off efforts at social democracy. If Piketty is right, then you can read Latin America's history since the 1913 end of the Belle Epoque in Europe as a forecast of what Europe is going to be like in the middle of the next century, in terms of elite dominance of politics, in terms of a willingness to overthrow the game of electoral politics on small pretexts. And somebody should. I expect somebody is, right? So. Yes?
Yeah, did you say anything in regards to the development, relative development of the North and Latin America in relation to the ethnic and racial compositions of the two, and how that relates to, say, human capital?
Lots of people talk about ethnic and racial divisions and human capital accumulation. I've never seen much sign that it's at all durable. You know, that is certainly in places where governments are uninterested in educating. Very large chunks of their population, people won't get educated and won't have the human capital to do so. Yeah, that virtually no society on its own, or no society can the poorest part of the society pull its human capital level up substantially by its own bootstraps in any relatively short period of time. It takes either much longer or it takes a common public commitment that these people, they may look differently from us, but they are, after all, our citizens. And it's to my grandchildren's advantage to have well-educated whatsits, you know, living next to them, working in the same economy as them. And that has certainly played a substantial role. How substantial, I don't know, right? That I've been much more a believer with the late Ken Sokoloff and with Stan Engerman, that it's primarily class and party rather than, you know, ethnicity and culture that determines large-scale socioeconomic cleavages over the course of any substantial period of time. You know, but that's simply what happens if you come out of an economics department, right? If I came out of an anthropology department, I might think very differently. And I have nothing, no strong reason to believe that this prejudice of mine is the correct one. So.
Unfortunately, I think
Okay.
we're
out of time.
I
Okay.
want to thank Brad DeLong again for being with us here today. And I think it is a topic that I hope we have an opportunity to return to. It certainly runs through a lot of the issues that are very contemporary in Latin America. What's going on in Chile right now in educational reform, tax reform, et cetera, was just what you ended with. So thank you for being with us.